All right, cool. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for facilitating. We've had some great presentations today. I'm going to try to draw out those connections when I see them. But I'd like to just start off talking about kind of the overall argument I make in my honors thesis, which is that this institution, the YWCA, which is not the YMCA of Village People fame, just to say that up front, they're different organizations, so don't ask me about the YMCA. But they occupied a very complex position in the Middle East during the World War I era and the interwar period. And I kind of explore, I really enjoyed, Hillary, you use this phrase, uncomfortable nuances, and that's a really good phrase for my kind of analysis of the role of the association, that they occupied some really uncomfortable, a place of very uncomfortable nuance, where they were both a culturally imperialist organization and like a humanitarian organization that was often meaningful to local women. And yeah, that can be kind of a source of discomfort when there's this like urge to categorize things in terms of like, is this a good or a bad organization? You know what I mean? What emerged for me doing this, feel free to come in, yes. What emerges is the fact that humanitarianism and cultural supremacism are not necessarily mutually exclusive ideologies, and that's kind of what I explore. So I'm just going to take you guys through my chapters and kind of the sub-arguments I make in my chapters. We can talk more broad scale at the end. So chapter 1, it's entitled Hygienic Imperialism, and I examine the YWCA's participation in what I call a sanitizing mission, or an attempt to kind of uplift local populations through incentivizing the adoption of Euro-American hygienic practices and also new patterns of product consumption. So my main primary source I use for this, and I'll come back to this slide, I promise, but is a 1936 study called Muslim Women Enter a New World by Ruth Frances Woodsmall, who was the executive secretary of the YWCA in the region for the time period I'm looking at. And in this book, Woodsmall really focuses on bodily reform, and she focuses on these twin specters of the superstitious Arab mother and the daya, the traditional midwife, pictured here, as kind of personifications of what she frames as the essentialized ignorance of the East, you know. And as kind of Woodsmall demonstrates in the book, there are diaper competitions, baby swaddling workshops, and kind of the incentivization of the purchasing of particular commodities in an attempt to bring communities in Iraq, Egypt, and Palestine visually closer to Protestant American aesthetic preferences. And something that Quinn discussed is like this idea that dress was supposed to visually show what someone's ideology is, you know, and that's a kind of theme I also explore in some depth in my project, and how these missionaries were very interested in how women represented modernity or backwardness, and interested in bringing women closer to the aesthetics of modernity. So I see some resonances there as well. So yeah, one of the things that kind of separated the daya from a modern midwife was, you know, so she has this whole anecdote about these Egyptian midwives that get licensed. And she's like, these midwives are so modern, they do so much of a better job. She does not talk about like, do they deliver more healthy babies? That's not what she's talking about. She's not talking about, do they like sanitize, like, I don't know, do they like use certain instruments? She actually doesn't talk about midwifery at all. She says, these Egyptian midwives drive a red Chevrolet, and that's why they're better. And that's very interesting, thinking about like genuinely, if you read this book, you'd be like, why is she talking about this red Chevrolet? She calls it like a convincing piece of health propaganda. What does red Chevrolet in Cairo have to do with midwifery? It's like about these products of pattern consumption and how like proximity to certain patterns of consumerism was what made those midwives more modern, you know? So that's kind of the argument I go with in that chapter. And I also, you know, kind of try to read against the grain of what Woodsmall is arguing, that maybe instead of being, you know, grateful recipients of modernity, there's another way to read Woodsmall's text, you know? There's this quote, you can read it for yourself, but she portrays this young mother's fright when she sees her baby washed by a nurse. And, you know, I read this as, this is a woman whose baby is being touched in ways she's like, there's not necessarily a translator, she might not be comfortable with. So I do some work reading against the grain there. Yeah, in chapter 2, I kind of continue to examine the YWCA's attempt to produce virtuous bodies, but I turn to the question of athletics. And this is a great kind of sketch of a baseball diamond where the YWCA was very interested in labeling the ethnicities of each of the girls who were playing this game of baseball in 1932 by the Bosphorus. We see Jewish girl, Armenian girl, Scotch girl, Turkish girl. And that's because they were very interested in this idea that sports would obliterate distinction and democratize the women of Istanbul. So you have to remember, this is a time when, questions of ethnicity and state were very in the air post-World War I. We're talking dissolution of Ottoman Empire, the construction of new ethno-states that totally shaped the way the region looks, and the YWCA construed their project as through the power of sports, we are overcoming ethnic distinction, and very particular sports. Something that some of you may know if you are a basketball fan is basketball as well as volleyball were sports developed to promote muscular Christianity. They're basically founded as sports that would disseminate Protestant ideals and bodily ideals. And they were very interested in using those sports to bring those bodies kind of in closer proximity to the virtues of Protestant kind of civilization. One of the YWCA women talked about how the women of Istanbul post-war were eager for Western civilization, and she then elaborated in the same letter, we're talking basketballs, gym uniforms, Yeah, and here's a great quote. No department of the association created more spirit of democracy. A gymnasium suit and games, so thinking about products, obliterated social or educational distinctions. It was here that members got a new vision of a complete life, of the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, a part of life in its wholeness. Okay, I know we're kind of breezing through, but feel free to ask more questions at the end when we do our Q&A. Getting to that question of, back to Quinn's point, of whose bodies are seen as visibly modern. This is a quote from this scrapbook. All the villagers in the old Turkish costume were there, and the contrast was very strong between old and new Turkey, as you see in the picture. And you see the YWCA, very into this product of visibly modernizing women's bodies, and that's a very kind of rich and troubling thing to investigate, which I tried to do in this project. Yeah, we've talked about this already. Oh yeah, there you go. Oh yes, I was paraphrasing this. We need basketballs, volleyballs, basketball outfits. The girls are eager for Western civilization. This was the rhetoric that was going on, And it's I don't know, for me it's so jarring to see the word basketball in this kind of context, but I don't know, that was an interesting part of this project. So chapter 3 kind of takes a different approach, while chapters 1 and 2 examined the YWCA's attempt to manufacture new wants and kind of bodily anxieties, responding to a need which they themselves had produced. Anyway, chapter 3 documents the YWCA's response to a very different kind of need, So 1915 is the beginning of the Armenian genocide. And the YWCA played a really outsized role in the kind of American humanitarian response to that crisis that's often not disaggregated from Near East Relief, which is the overarching umbrella organization that kind of brought a lot of different associations, organizations in the region into a coalition. But the YWCA occupied a really outsized role running these rescue homes for Armenian women. That was their terminology, not mine. But that were very invested in kind of housing and providing occupational opportunities for Armenian women. Also for Russian women, because we're talking also, this is the era of the Russian Civil War. Something I did not know that surprised me in this project was that hundreds of thousands of white Russians, so Tsar backing villages and stuff, people migrated across the Black Sea, and a ton of people ended up in Istanbul. And the YWCA provided a lot of services for those women. And very specific services. There was this specter, there was this fear of Russian prostitution in Istanbul that was perhaps extremely inflated, who's to say, but not me. But the YWCA was very invested and documented this heavily of, we've got to get these women to stop doing prostitution and do safe and wholesome employment conditions. Here's a quote about that. There's a euphemistic service in bars or restaurants where moral conditions are very dangerous, which is a euphemism for prostitution. So that was, and this is a picture of kind of more salubrious form of work, wage labor. The YWCA was very interested in incorporating these refugees into the wage labor market. Kind of the last thing I look at in this chapter is one of these women, I don't know which one, but she's in there, Theodora Isakidu. Her diary was an amazing primary source for me to look at, because she's a woman who was part of the YWCA in Smyrna, now Izmir in Turkey. She was displaced when that city was burned and ethnically cleansed, and started a new life for herself in Athens, in modern-day Greece, where you see a lot of women who were displaced from Smyrna go. And her diary reveals that a lot of women who were part of the YWCA in Smyrna stayed a part of the YWCA in Athens. And that fascinated me, because it was the site of continuity in a time of profound, trauma, uprooting, rupture in their lives. And that really troubled my idea of I think coming into this project, I had an idea that the YWCA was very unilaterally cultural imperialist, but seeing how it also was a meaningful entity for kind of retaining those social bonds was fascinating for me, and really complicated the argument I was making. So I'm about all out of time, but oh yeah, we're not gonna look at that. Let's go to the first slide again. Basically, just to reiterate, my central argument is that it's about kind of local women's agency reading against the grain of that archive. There's Osama Moktasi, who's a historian. To paraphrase him, women of the region were not Aztecs, and the YWCA's American missionary reformers were not traveling in the company of conquistadors. Local women, to some degree, had to want to go to missionary health clinics, had to intentionally enroll in gym classes. And through this project, and through examining the body politics of an association like the YWCA, it kind of allows us to take seriously the production of new wants, and consider seriously the motivations and local contexts that drew women to a YWCA health clinic in Baghdad, to a physical education course in Istanbul, or to a YWCA rescue home in Athens. So, with that, me and my fellow presenters are gonna take some questions. Thank you so much for your attentiveness in this very hot and loud room. I appreciate it.